All right, so welcome everyone. Today, I'm Ikhlaq Sidhu. I'm the Director and Chief Scientist for Sitar's Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Innovation-X Roundtable. The topic is Future of Journalism in the Age of News Entertainment. And a little bit of background. We're hosting these innovation roundtables because, frankly, a lot has been changing in the world. I don't know that we have a record of change, in 2020 versus all the other years before or not, but a lot's been changing in health conditions, in the global economy, the ways that we consume things, and in parallel. And I think this started certainly before the most recent changes of this year, but a lot's been changing in news. And that has, to me, that has a multiplier effect on all the other changes, because these things are all linked with each other, the effects of these changes. So as I said, today's roundtable, Future of Journalism in the Age, in the Age of News, Entertainment, yeah. Okay, we want to hold this session like all the other ones, partly as a mini advisory board meeting. So we have a distinguished set of, quote, panelists / roundtable, contestants at roundtable guests. And one thing that we'd like to get from the conversation is, how does Berkeley, how does the Sitar Center engage? How do students engage in the topics? And how do we collaborate with the relevant people in industry and academia and so forth? So it's bringing those things together. I need 1 minute or two to tell everyone what is the center. So I'm going to use basically one slide for that, and I'm going to try to share that. Usually at about this time, any sort of technical difficulty can happen. I need actually access to be able to share the slide.
That would be Keith or Jen.
1 moment.
Okay.
Okay, it's coming along. Here we go. So this is a title page. I'm going to try to put this into presentation mode. Hold on. All right, does everybody see a slide and not speaker notes?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. All right, so there's really only one slide to show, which is the next one. Let me move it along. So this is the overview of what's happening at the center. The goal of the center is to empower innovators to change the world, and in particular, positively change the world. There is more than one way to change the world, apparently. So the positive brings in the ethical component. We have 3 categories of things that the center does. One is there's a section of courses which we generally refer to as part of the framework of Berkeley method of entrepreneurship. And the types of things that happen there are that students learn in challenge situations, story, mindset, behavior, diverse team formation. If anything, what's going on, we're developing the psychology of the person, developing the person, not just the venture. So while they're working on their venture idea, we're working on their core capability to be the type of person that can do those new things. A second category of things that we're doing in the center is more on the innovation and maybe ecosystem building, innovation and convening different people together. So we have X Labs in data, blockchain, plant-based meat. We do one in 5G and AI. And all of these are basically a platform where industry players and students and different researchers are coming together And that mixing is creating activity and connections that don't otherwise happen. And then the third thing, this third category, is that what we learn from the first two, that is from the courses on, in a way, entrepreneurial process and on the innovation labs, we translate that into professional education and global outreach throughout the world. One of our highlights is the Engineering Leadership Professional Program. That one is attended by everyone in Silicon Valley and lots of people globally. It's like an MBA, but for technical people that wouldn't otherwise take it. We have people from Apple, Google, Yahoo, Network Appliances, Samsung, Cisco, you know, the whole line. Anyway, there's many other things that fall in that third category. And all combined, this is just a large ecosystem. I'm gonna unshare the slide. I think that's enough background, both for the roundtable. That's enough background for both the roundtable participants as well as for the audience. Like I said, we're really interested in connecting the things that you're going to be talking about today to what we can be doing at the center. Now I'm going to hand it off to Ken Singer. So Ken is a former tech entrepreneur, but now spends his time working with aspiring entrepreneurs here at Berkeley and around the world. As Chief Learning Officer at the center, he's developing educational programs to bring innovation training to all parts of society. So with that, let me hand it over to Ken, and we're really looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Iklak. And so great background on our center. And one of the reasons why we have these roundtables is we really don't know where things are going. And so what we've learned is to have conversations with people who are working at the edges of their industries to see if there's a seed of an idea that needs to be brought back to the university for researchers, for students, and for others to work on so that we can help advance whatever is happening in industry. So that's kind of how we view ourselves. We're not the ivory tower, despite the fact that there's one right behind me in my video. But we want to be engaged with what society is dealing with today, and which is why this particular topic is very interesting for us. It wasn't one of the initial ideas, one of the initial topics we were going to explore in the roundtable, but I thought it would be a shame during this very interesting times, I know that's quite an understatement, to have a conversation with people who are responsible for telling the stories, advancing the knowledge to the masses about what's happening in their industry with all the technology and the COVID-related crises. How's that affecting the way that they're creating, delivering, and talking about the things that matter in society? So we wanted to bring people from all over the world, all over this industry, to have a roundtable. And just first a note about the format of this roundtable. We want this to be a real roundtable, not a panel. So as the moderator, I intend to prime the conversation, but we want the roundtable participants to have a lively conversation with each other. We want them to share their unique insights, but also to debate with each other about where they think things are going. And as you can see, everyone in this roundtable is human. No AI was invited to this discussion, though that might have been a good idea since I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about it. We also understand that journalism is a very broad topic, and we know we only have about 50 minutes to talk. So we chose 3 critical themes to explore today: news production, news delivery, news veracity, which we all know is a rabbit hole in this post-truth era, so we will tread lightly on that one. But the theme of today's roundtable is the intersection of journalism and technology. How is technology changing journalism, especially in these unusual times? So I'm going to ask Lisa to kick it off by addressing this question. Have new online consumption habits due to COVID created opportunities, habits due to COVID created opportunities for journalism? What has been the impact? And if you could also, Lisa, introduce yourself before you answer that.
My name's Lisa Gibbs. I'm the Director of News Partnerships at the Associated Press, which is a global news agency. We produce journalism mainly for other news outlets to use. My role as Director of News Partnerships includes working on collaborations with other news outlets. We get grants from foundations to support our journalism. And it also involves working with an AP strategy group on how do we leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning in our newsroom. So that's my somewhat lengthy introduction. I have a sort of weird portfolio of things that I do. To Ken's question, I mean, clearly, like, there are a number of ways and angles to come at that. As an overarching statement, I'll say that primarily the pandemic accelerated trends that already were happening across the news industry. So there was a tremendous increase in online audience, people seeking out news online and on their phones, and even an increase in subscriptions to news organizations. However, the financial loss of advertising and revenue from events and conferences and sponsorships and things like that, essentially newsrooms, news organizations are more strapped than ever. Drawing that out a little bit, it's accelerated the decline of print publication. More and more news organizations are stopping actually printing a newspaper, and that's now happening faster. At the same time, from a coverage perspective, I mean, we've seen a couple of things. Certainly the challenge of covering all the facets of the pandemic has actually taken resources away from a lot of other topics. So you've seen newsrooms have to cover things like climate and environment less, because they're busy covering the pandemic. And then you layer on top of that things like racial injustice protests, wildfires in the West, our presidential election. These are massive stories that just require so much resources that you find newsrooms just really having to make very hard decisions about what they can afford to tell stories about. I will note that there have been a few areas that are considered beneficiaries of the pandemic. There's an increase in coverage of things like food, what would be considered good news, because people want to read some good and happy news during these times. Obituaries, unfortunately, telling the stories of people we've lost to the pandemic. So there have been these kind of shifts in coverage strategies among newsrooms, some forced by pandemic and having to choose how you're going to use your scarce resources, and then others that have been driven by consumption habits we've seen, that tendency toward wanting, good news or, how to cook and things like that. I'd be really curious how a news organization like the Washington Post has seen these kinds of things play out. Unlike us, the Washington Post, does depend on driving traffic and driving subscriptions. And so, Jared, I'm sure you have a much, different and interesting view of these issues.
Yeah, thank you. So, hey, everyone, I'm Jared Dicker. I oversee the commercial organization at the Washington Post, which is about 100, I think at this point it's grown like 130 people that work across all principles, engineering, business to help grow all of our businesses at the Post, and then also R&D to create new businesses and new ventures. So it's an awesome opportunity to focus on news, but also try to focus on new business models. From the business side, it's been very interesting. I think I'd say when the virus first hit and the advertising market responded, as Lisa mentioned, there was a real bottom out in the programmatic landscape, which is, how much or how many publishers, right, are driving their advertising revenue right now outside of direct sales. That has rebounded to the point where I think we're almost stable, if not higher, across the industry, where CPM levels, which is kind of what we look at as the cost that advertisers are delivering on sites, has somewhat leveled off. The subscription business, especially in the kind of bigger subscription groups within news like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, has also grown significantly. There is a strong support, I'd say, sentiment for readers to subscribe. There's been a lot of new kind of like technical innovation to really figure out how to drive more subscriptions across at least like the Washington Post. And we found that to be kind of very beneficial from a business perspective. What's really been interesting, one of our big businesses that we created outside of the Washington Post is two software as a service arms. One is Arc Publishing, which is content management systems and workflow management systems that we created about 5 years ago, and has now become a very, very, very big multi-million-dollar software business. And Zeus, which is also a revenue software that we license across different partners as well. And we found that during this time, there's been a lot of activity of a lot of media publishers, especially local news, signing on and licensing our software. So Washington Post software powers the Boston Globe, powers Dallas Morning News, all of the McClatchy sites, which is about 35 local news properties, Graham, Seattle Times, and Dallas Morning News, which has been a very exciting moment, I'd say, in news media innovation, because if everyone could remember, not too long ago, a lot of strategies were siloed. You really didn't want to share. I mean, I could speak for the Post and the New York Times. We weren't really running to the table to share our strategies and try to collaborate with one another. It was very much how we could focus on building our own business. And the fact that a lot of news organizations are not just willing to start to collaborate and talk about how to build a better, more lucrative ecosystem for journalism, but they're in fact sharing the software, managing fixed costs by leveraging things that aren't necessarily core to their business, has been an amazing thing to watch. So there's a lot of collaboration, especially in the local news system, to
Jared,
really think about how we do this. Sorry.
So I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about that. What precipitated this orientation shift from competitive to cooperative? Because there has to be something there that triggered a whole group of people to independently decide, wait, we need to work together. It's not like we all woke up one day and say, oh, we're going to be Swedish and we're all going to be, we're going to be all collaborative, right? What happened culturally in that industry?
Yeah, I think there were two pressure points, two crisis points, I'd say. I don't think it was necessarily voluntary. The first was when we first created Arc Publishing, which is simply in the beginning was like a WordPress, right? A way for sites to be able to create newsrooms and deliver content. At that moment, I remember news organizations weren't even talking to us. The idea that they would leverage a software from a competitor was something that they'd rather not do. And at that point, for those unfamiliar, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. So a lot of people, even though we're separate companies, a lot of people are driving similarities of what kind of Washington Post software could do in a similar kind of Amazonian type approach, even though I promise that is definitely not the case. But when Facebook and kind of a lot of these distributed platforms came about and media companies started to realize that they were spending a lot of money building their own technology systems, managing those systems, having everything be customized, there was kind of this shift of saying we could drive a lot more profitability and allocate our attention and resources towards our newsroom, which is our core product, if we weren't having to maintain all of this software. Mm-hmm. So that's where the first moment out of crisis really came, was that media companies were starting to lose revenue to Facebook and Google in the advertising set, and they really started to look at what things were actually important for them to own and manage. And software wasn't necessarily that. They felt they could share that, and Washington Post was a resource. The second with Zeus has really accelerated during the coronavirus, I'd say. When we were opening up a revenue software, kind of end of last year, you could imagine 3 years ago if I would have went to McClatchy and said, hey, we're going to give you a revenue software that's going to drive you more revenue for free, they'd tell us to go to hell, right? Because they're going to be like, you're our competitors, we're not going to give our revenue pipes to you, right? But now, not only do they leverage the software, but they actually pay for it because they see the value and they see the return. And I think it's a similar shift, like the shift where media companies said, we need to focus on news and creating content, which is our product. We don't need to be engineering companies, which was kind of the media 2.0 feeling. BuzzFeed, HuffPost, and all of these companies kind of injected that feeling. There was this recognition that that was actually a cost that didn't help the core. I think we're seeing that amazingly on the revenue side as well, where a lot of these media companies are saying, why are we focusing so much on our revenue software? Why are our sales teams 50% of our company when we're a news and media organization? We should actually be flipping that and putting more emphasis and more investment on the content creators and the ones that are delivering on the journalism, and try to figure out how we can manage or license or kind of manage the fixed costs on the revenue side. So it's been two kind of amazing moments that have happened very aggressively.
So yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Ken, I just wanted to jump in to say that you've seen that same kind of trend around collaboration in the newsroom itself. So, and in some ways, the drivers of that are very parallel to what Jared's talking about on the business side. Why should there be 30 news outlets covering the same story? It doesn't make sense from a use of resources situation. And so, like most things, while it seems like it happened overnight, it's actually been this sort of gradual 10-year trend where these two news outlets work together on a project, and then suddenly more start doing it and more start doing it and more start doing it. And now you have networks. And 5 years ago, the Center for Cooperative Media was created at Montclair State University. And in other words, you've seen this idea of collaboration in news being an actual discipline with best practices and strategies, really happen and take off. So I just wanted to throw that in there and add to what Jared's saying. Like, not only is there that collaboration around understanding that it doesn't make sense for all these media companies to devote all these resources to engineering when they're content companies. Similarly, our newsroom coverage strategies are increasingly following that same path. I just wanted to throw that in.
That's fantastic. And I want to actually take it over to Agnes in a second, because I want to internationalize this conversation. But I'm trying to see if there are some trends here. Is it that your news organizations still believe that they are news organizations and not technology firms? Because the greatest threats to your industry, as you've just listed, were Facebook and Google and Reddit, and they consider themselves technology companies, but they're the ones eating at your revenue the most. So I want to leave that there. Terrible, right? I'm leaving that there. I want to introduce Agnes here to the conversation, and maybe if you'd like to address that big elephant I just pushed into the room, and maybe introduce yourself and join us.
Thank you for that elephant. Yes, hi from Stockholm, Sweden, the international perspective. My name is Agnes Stenbom, and I work as the responsible data and AI specialist at Schibsted. Schibsted is the biggest media group in the Nordics. We are based in Norway, but operate all across the Nordics and Poland. We run the major news destinations in our markets and lots of other digital consumer brands. I would say that Schibsted is very much both a publisher and a tech company. You can be both. I think you need to be both. My fluffy title is supposed to tell you that I work with lots of different strategic projects related to how and why we use AI across our portfolio. I have a background in product, so I used to work with machine learning solutions for all of our different brands. I'm also doing research at KTH in Stockholm, so I'm looking specifically at the topic of journalism and AI. So I have one foot in theory and the rest of my body in very much in practice. And when you started asking about if publishers are becoming tech companies, and if we are tech companies, I would say that yes, we are, and we pretty much always have been. Journalism and storytelling has always been evolving through new technologies. While I do think that we live in extraordinarily exciting times for tech and journalism, it can be helpful to kind of remember that change brought by new tools is kind of inherent to what we do. So I work with one specific type of tool, and that is AI. And I think that's one of the major shifts that we are working with in Schibsted, and I think as an industry right now. How can we leverage all these new opportunities is a conversation that we could have.
Absolutely. Maybe you could explain for the audience just what is the state of the art of AI in journalism? Because you know, typically when you hear the word AI, and I know our images are changing, right? How we connect things, but for most people, when you hear AI, you think of a robot that's kind of being human, but AI is more, it's much broader than that. So if you could tell us how AI is conceptualized within your industry.
Definitely. So starting off, I think it's important to acknowledge that AI is not one technology, not a type of, or one tool, but it is a huge new toolbox that we can use in lots of different ways, not just in media, but in society. So for us in media, I think using AI technologies like machine learning, tools like natural language processing, natural language generation, so processing and understanding text, but also creating new text or new language. Computer vision solutions, all of these new tools are really exciting ways for us to create, distribute, analyze news content in new ways. There's tons of exciting things that we can do. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the focus of the journalism industry or the journalists. So rather than focusing on all of these opportunities that we have ahead of us, a lot of the people in the media workforce, they worry about the downsides that these technologies bring. There was a global survey that was done by the London School of Economics last year, and they showed that fear of job replacement, worries about spreading misinformation, concerns about the gaps between technical and editorial staff, all these themes, they end up having this great negative influence on newsroom attitudes towards AI. So that's quite bad news, since there is a lot of potential.
You're right. So you're dealing with Prometheus kind of situation here, where you've got fire, can be used for good or for bad. And I want to bring Sabine into the conversation. And maybe you could introduce yourself first, because I think you could contribute to this question of AI in the newsroom.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Very quickly, my background is in broadcast journalism and international development. Right now, I'm working on strategic plans, development plan around machine learning, new technologies, and AI to make it more sustainable and responsible, and really focusing on this idea of diversity and pluralism. And just before that, I was the head of the San Francisco office of journalism and technologies for Reporters Without Borders, where we dealt with a lot of these issues that are really problematic in this digital era that sounds so archaic, that we live in, such as content moderation issues, you know, online harassment, misinformation, because I think that one of the things about AI that's very tricky is that a lot of it is invisible. And so to track some of these issues becomes really difficult and problematic. But going back to the newsroom, your question about the newsroom, I think as part of the news reporting, news processing life of the newsroom, there are a lot of repetitive tasks that are very tedious, including, you know, logging content and tapes. And I think that, you know, AI and machine learning have been really used to support journalists so that they can devote more time in journalism as such and less on these very time-consuming, tedious tasks. And that has been really one of the, you know, the positive sides. I think that on the challenges for many newsroom is AI and new technologies, ML, they represent quite an investment, not only in terms of cost, but in terms of time, making sure that your staff is equipped to really deal with the new technology, to integrate it efficiently, but also to keep nurturing these new technologies. Because as we know, the news cycle is moving very fast and technology is moving just as fast. So it's something that is constantly evolving. And so you have, you know, these issues that surface in this newsroom with adoption. What will be the most really efficient thing to to adopt as part of the newsroom. That's where I think Jared and Lisa's explanations earlier about, banding together on some of that technology makes so much sense.
I'm a quasi-academic, so I need to throw in an academic term, and that's hybridization. Hybridization is this notion of human beings and machines excelling together, supporting each other, celebrating each other's strengths. And just like Sabine said, I think one way of promoting constructive hybridization would be to routinely practice decomposition in news work. So by really decomposing, breaking down big news projects into these small, really tangible tasks, like look at data set X or go through this global data set that would be really, really tedious for a journalist. If we're able to break down our news work, our tasks into smaller pieces, then we'll be better equipped at knowing like when can we employ AI? When is the work more suitable for a machine? And a human being can focus on uniquely human.
And is that term hybridization, or is it cyborgization? Like, at what point does that intersection become blurred?
We've called it the augmented journal. We've used that term. In other words, like we're not automating news, but we're augmenting the journalist, we're enabling them to do, more, better, faster, whatever it is, with new tools. So I've seen the term augmented newsroom used a lot, which is getting at that hybridization, that Agnes is talking about. And just to pick up real quickly on something was what Agnes was talking about, surveys and kind of some of the negative views toward AI. I think something that's important to understand about the industry in general is, a couple of things. First of all, when an industry is under stress financially and struggling with how to use its resources, I do think like that becomes a barrier to innovation, because there's not, as we said, like there's not the money, but there's also not the time and the energy to think about new things. We're working overtime just trying to do the job that we need to do today. So, I think that the issue of readiness to innovate is a serious structural issue for media in general, especially smaller or local news organizations. And I think, it's easy to kind of get caught up in like all the reasons why we shouldn't try something new because we're worried about, whether we don't really have time to take risks on things that might work. So I think that this is a real challenge. And also when we've had discussion about journalism and AI, there has to be a recognition that it's pretty hard for a news company to bring in data scientists and machine learning experts when they're all being hired by Amazon and Google at salaries way higher than what news organizations can pay. So I think there's also a structural issue around technological expertise and literacy in journalism, that needs to be dealt with. But like Agnes and Sabine both are completely right when we talk about the opportunities that frankly, I think we all know, like the news industry is not leveraging. Agnes is working on projects around how do we use technologies to make sure that journalism is more inclusive and not biased. As Sabine said, there's tremendous opportunity around making more efficient the production of news and eliminating routine tasks from journalists. So, and there is a lot going on. Like, I don't think we should discount that. There are some really fascinating projects going on. Everything from automatically generating stories to, automatically summarizing stories or live transcription of video and, all sorts of things. But really, a big issue is a lot of this is happening at the very large media companies, and how do we get that down to the smaller local companies?
So Lisa, I want to underscore something you said, because I've been remiss. I did not mention the fact that this entire roundtable was made possible by our partnership with the School of Journalism at Berkeley. They've introduced us to all of you, and they are shifting, as I understand, their attention towards these types of issues that you have all talked about. And I know there are several journalism students in the audience right now, and I just want to make sure that they heard this part where data scientists are making lots of money in other places, and companies like, you know, the AP and most likely the Washington Post can't find anyone to hire. So if you want job security, you may want to take a look at some of the classes that we teach on data science, and hopefully we'll have that mixed with journalism. Just a shameless plug right there, but I thought that would be a good opportunity to bring them into this conversation. But I'd like to actually point over to Jared about some of this stuff. We talked about AI creating stories.
Hey, can I interject a question? If you like it,
Yeah.
you can even ask it on behalf. But I want to know if does the panel think that AI will become like the way that fake news gets reduced, or is it really, or is it alternatively the path to the end of truth? It's a really, like, it could really go in either direction. I'm curious if anyone's got a thought on it.
Yeah, I mean, I do for sure. I think we've toggled, like, kind of very similar to what Lisa was saying. Like, we've always thought about AI in our newsroom as kind of like a superpower for journalists rather than something that replaces journalists. So how can we make fact checking or researching or transcoding, right, text to audio or video somewhat more seamless, but still managed by the human side of things. We've actually, we put a lot of our data scientists actually on the commercial side of things because we saw like what Facebook has been able to do from a revenue perspective when they put smart engineers on the ad side. And we actually purposely put a lot of our AI focus there on the revenue side in order to like figure out behaviors and things of that nature. But to directly answer your question, this is why, so I'm a recovering blockchain CEO, but still insanely blockchain obsessed. And the company that I founded was called Poet. And the whole idea around Poet was to be able to seek provenance on information, basically tied to misinformation, right? We found that, especially when you're looking at people like outside of our media circles or, you know, coastal bubbles, whatever you want to refer to it. The more that I saw in my previous time of being at the Washington Post, say, this is true and this is why, the more you'd see naysayers say, well, that's just you saying it, right? And you kind of see this sort of divide between like information that's being delivered. There's crazy things that have happened that people have leveraged to like delegitimize news, one of which was the way that our perspective opinion articles were labeled when they were shared to Facebook didn't carry through the op-ed. So there would be a lot of people being like, well, how is the Washington Post real news when they're reporting on Melania Trump's dress, right? They have nothing else to report on, but it was an opinion writer. But the way that things were labeled, it wasn't labeled. So there were people that would discredit, right, the content or the value of what we were doing because of how things carried through. And what I found with blockchain that was really interesting to like think about AI was that I don't think we solve misinformation by having more human intervention saying this is right and this is wrong. I think that that continues to like push people aside, and people know that, look, when you read the AP, you know, it is facts, right? Like that is where news and resource and Reuters is coming from. Like that is objective, that subjective analysis is being built off of. However, what I found and what I was building at Poet is like, can you essentially expose the information behind a piece of work or behind the provenance of how content got to somewhere so that people could just make more informed decisions? So instead of saying we're fact checking Donald Trump and what he said was wrong and what he said was right, there should be a way where there's a decentralized element of data coming out that is, you know, there's no one in the middle messing with that, that enables you to see, okay, the links in this article link to here, and this is something that has been validated and so forth, because then we're just giving people more information to make better decisions, kind of like smoking cigarettes. Rather than banning cigarettes, we just say, hey, you know, if you smoke these, they're likely going to eventually kill you. And we've seen people stop or slow down smoking cigarettes. I think information, even though it's not federally regulated, is an interesting way to think about that as well, as like information exposure for people to make their own decisions, but have more information behind them.
Yeah, you know, sorry, I just want to say this one line. In another domain, you would call that like the supply chain of news.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly right.
Just to piggyback on what Jared was saying, and in relation to this very important question about truth, the information landscape and ecosystem has changed so much, and that's something that journalists are really fighting from all perspectives. You know, there's no clear differentiation between an article from the New York Times or the Washington Post, Jared, or AP, and something that is, you know, sponsored advertising, propaganda, somebody's blog. It can all be, you know, made to look the same. And so who do you trust in this very blurry environment? And how do you approach AI in that, at that level as well? Because journalism has, you know, very specific standards in the way you report on a story. And a lot of this new technology, this is something that I think is lurking on the horizon, is how do you apply these same journalistic standards on the technology that is being used to report the news? And I think I would just add, I mean, this is a whole conversation in itself, and I'm sure Lisa has a lot of things to say, and Agnes, and everybody actually, about that, but it's really a very blurry landscape, and that's why you've also seen a lot of initiatives. Reporters Without Borders was involved with one, the BBC is involved in one, in trying to bring together professionals from the journalism industry with big tech companies or social media platforms, with advertisers, to try to come up with a way of addressing these issues, one of which is to really provide support and differentiate and surface real journalism in search results from, you know, all the rest, including misinformation. So I think there's really a lot of talk and energy spent on these issues, both at the immediate level and also how these technologies are evolving, and how do you communicate them to your viewers and the broader public.
I just want to point out that we were good enough to get through 30 minutes of discussion without talking about news veracity and truth. So I think we've all earned the right to go down the rabbit hole now, since it's the last 15 minutes. So I'm just going to open it up to all of you. Where are we going with truth? What's going? How's technology going to impact it, good and for bad? And I do want to point out, I'm a little bit biased here, because I was in my previous life as an entrepreneur, I spent a lot of time in social media, helping in the mobile space, bring social media to folks, and you know, user created content and things like that. I did not know what kind of fire I was dealing with at the time, because it was very early. People, you know, companies were paying for us to do this. Today, that user generated content is what I believe is really destroying everything. You know, everyone's opinion is their own truth now because of this user generated stuff. And so I've been humbled by my own journey through advancing technologies that I didn't quite understand what their impact would be. And another shameless plug, I'm trying to teach a class in the next year called Responsible Innovation in the Era of AI. So Sabine, I'm going to definitely have you in class, because I think this is such an important topic. But for all of you who are practitioners in journalism right now, playing with this early version of fire, of AI and blockchain for Jared, where could this go? Good and for bad, if we all get back together in 10 years and we have this roundtable again, what will we be talking about that just happened in those 10 years?
I mean, I could just say something really quickly that I find fascinating, is that, you know, in the States, at least, we always think of misinformation, like we point fingers at, or not point fingers, it's very much, it's very much rationalized that, you know, Facebook is basically, you know, a kind of venue for misinformation, and based on, I love that old Wall Street Journal article, which was red state, blue state. Depending on what you follow and people you're friends with, your feed is literally tailored to, continue to kind of put those notions on you. But when I visited, I was in Senegal last year for an innovation and media conference for all of Africa. And it's amazing when you talk about misinformation in that continent, it's all peer-to-peer, right? It's not a feed where people are getting this information based on what's personalized, but it's family members in a WhatsApp chat that are sending an unverified link. And when you're getting, what's really interesting is when you're getting that link from your aunt or from a cousin, who else are you supposed to trust more than family, right? So, and how do you regulate or monitor how that misinformation gets spread when it starts to go out of an algorithm and starts to go peer-to-peer? So I'll just leave that there for us to discuss, because I think also when we think about misinformation, there's this notion of how we protect ourselves against, social media as we think about it. But then you look at India and you look at Africa, and when WhatsApp is the biggest kind of problem, and it's not being monitored or can't be monitored, how do you stop word of mouth propaganda that's happening through these immediate peer-to-peer social or peer-to-peer comment streams?
So basically, that's digital COVID. You've just described digital COVID, where people are actually making their loved ones and close people the most at risk.
I'll just piggyback on that, not to be gloomy, because there are amazing opportunities, and I'm sure we'll mention them towards the end as well. But I think it's even worse than that, because this is from my RSF perspective. Every year we come out with our global index on press freedom, and there are more and more authoritarian governments around the world who have really outsmarted technology to use it, including social media, to spread misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and all the rest. So it's a very confused landscape. As Jared was saying, it's people to people, but it's also from the top down, as we've seen in a lot of cases around the world. And that's why, right now you have the two extreme that we like to talk about. You have, the news coming from Xi Jinping in China versus the news coming from Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. The journalists are no longer the gatekeepers of information. So in 10 years, I think that technology is catching up with, you have the problem of deep fakes, but you have also technologies that are catching up to try to identify algorithms and better identify the sources. But it's really, that's where this question of dealing with the symptoms versus the cause is so important.
We really can talk for 2 hours or more just about this. And I think there's so many interesting points. First of all, Ken, your question about what kind of conversation are we going to be having in 10 years? I think, and you noticed you didn't get an answer, because we don't even know what conversation we'll be having in 1 year. But just to throw out some things. So there's two, if the goal is an informed public, you both need to reduce misinformation and put good information in front. So there's two sides to that equation. And I don't think, curious what everyone else thinks, it's not like there's one big global, universal solution. I think there's just a lot of tactical things that need to be tried to address this. And I'm thinking, for example, about a company that I had talked to based out of London called Factmata that was looking at, building algorithms to assess content around things like, hate speech, racism, those kinds of things. And then the customer was really advertisers who didn't want their advertising placed by those articles. And when you think about it, it kind of gets at some things Jared was saying earlier, if you can attack it from a business model, if you can make it more unprofitable to put out misinformation, that's a pretty effective approach, actually, as opposed to wringing your hands about the problem of misinformation. On the other side of promulgating good information, we can't forget about the problem of news deserts you know, I mean, the health of local news outlets or news outlets in general connects directly to the misinformation problem. If you've got big areas of the world that do not have a trustworthy news or information organization, that just provides a vacuum for misinformation. And when Jared was mentioning Senegal, I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot is concern over Africa and the fact that Chinese and Russia state-owned media are providing their news for free. And so what does that do to African understanding of societal issues when their news is being provided to them for free by the Russian state and the Chinese state? So, I mean, there's just so many, like, can we schedule another 5-hour
follow-up call?
event just about?
I think that case that you mentioned, Lisa, about contextual advertising, I think it also brings a very interesting dilemma where technology is kind of steering the sentiment of what journalists choose to write about. So it's basic reward psychology. If journalists understand that their content isn't ranking high or isn't getting picked up by advertisers, then they don't want to write about those topics anymore. So we're currently exploring ML-generated contextual advertising, and this is a topic that we really haven't, we haven't found a smart solution. I'm not sure if you have.
It's the double-edged sword, really, of personalization, right? Newsrooms want to get better at personalizing because that's going to drive subscriptions and engagement. And yet, how do you do that in a way that does not reinforce the filter bubble and exacerbate problems on the other end? So, like, all of these issues seem to have kind of that double-edged sword aspect to them.
That was reflected also with the pandemic, I think, in terms of a lot of advertisers did not want to have their brand associated with news from the pandemic. And so it was, as a result, you know, that's like who you need the most funding from. And they would back away. As a result, a lot of the COVID coverage was reduced because of that. So it really had a direct impact on the coverage. Especially with smaller news organizations and networks.
Yeah, I mean, a big thing I'd say about business models too, to Lisa's point, is, you know, we, and this is a whole separate combo, but we as a industry, because of the threats of, or not threats of Facebook and Google, but because of the dominance of them taking over the advertising industry, there's been like a flock for these news businesses to figure out consumer models and subscription models. And in fact, you know, the more subscription models, the more expensive information becomes, the cheaper misinformation becomes, right? So we don't necessarily want to live in a society where all the news, only the people who can afford it can get the news, and people who can't afford it are getting whatever else is out there. So I think a huge emphasis, at least that I put on my team and when I speak to other organizations, is that we really need to think about an advertising model. It's not about brands monetizing attention. It's about information being accessible to everybody, which would be just such a setback in society if we lived in a world where only the people who could afford information, you know, were able to get it.
But Jared, you're actually talking about something that really, I think, core to this issue of journalism, which is journalism, as I see it, is kind of socialism. And what I mean by that is a news organization has certain responsibilities beyond just giving you what you want, right? They have to give you news that's important, the local things, obits, and information about the police blot, right? They have these responsibilities to their local constituents. The challenge, though, is once you have a threat to your business model, the things you are subsidizing, right, start having, it just kind of collapses. And this is what I think in 10 years, we're going to be looking at a vastly different organization. What we say is journalism is, I think, going to be redefined. We used to have bylines. You know, The Economist doesn't use it. The AP, I don't think, uses them. Will AI use them? You know, written by Watson or what? I mean, so I think we're going to even have the notion of what an article and who writes it and all of that will change. We've got 1 minute left, and I don't want to dominate this. So I usually end these roundtables with one question of our panelists, and if you guys could answer this real quickly. is if you were in school today, having had your experiences and looking into the future, what would you be studying right now to be prepared to be a leader for what the world will look like when you graduate? So, you know, the wisdom that you've carried and the experiences and scars, there's journalism students here, engineering students, people who are looking for a career and hopefully more than just a job, but a real career. Help them understand what you missed while you were in school that you would say, look, I should have learned that. I should have taken that course. This is the second time I've had journalists have speechless. Like, that's your job, is to have opinions, and I've literally made you speechless twice. So I apologize for that.
I will speak. I will say that if I was back in school, which I kind of am, I would focus on computer science and data science specifically. Try to really avoid silo thinking when going into the media space, and instead try to merge the conversation around data and technology and the editorial side. The two are completely interrelated. With better technology, we will create better editorial products and editorial content.
I actually agree with that. And even if you're interested really in being what would be traditionally thought of as a beat reporter, I think data literacy is key to doing your job more effectively and producing more authoritative, better informed journalism in general, much less the things that Agnes is talking about, which how do you really leverage data and computer science in news organizations as a whole. So I think data literacy and data skills in general is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna piggyback on that. I think it's a blend. I think the most successful, whether you're a challenger entrepreneur or working within a media company, skill you could have is to be like multilingual. So really understanding how engineering processes, how journalism processes, and really being able to speak multiple languages throughout the organization. I think I also love philosophy majors. I find that, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and Twitter is basically wannabe philosophers, but a lot of like very, very good conversations come out about new conversations. I'd say journalism oftentimes gets stuck in its processes and kind of gets in its own way, but when new ideas come about and new opportunities come about, they're usually very highly embraced, and they come from practices outside of the standards, whether that's engineering or philosophy or things like that. So.
Great.
For me, I think I'll cheat and answer the question differently. Maybe it's because I'm a Cal alumni, so the university was perfect. I was so happy with it, with all the classes I took. But I think both for journalists and for engineers, I would say it's obviously always important to recycle your skills. Data literacy and everything is just moving so quickly. But I would recommend going outside your comfort zone. If you're tech driven, maybe force yourself to do something where you are dealing with people, and vice versa with journalists. If you're more literary and inclined in writing, then force yourself to really get those tech skills and be able to operate efficiently in a newsroom. And I think just the final word is keep your end users or your readers or your viewers in mind. It's something that's so basic, and yet we see that it's often, not necessarily respected or thought about in that.
Teaching entrepreneurship, I agree. You have to always keep your customers in mind. That's something we even forget, and that's what we're supposed to be doing, is focusing on them. I want to thank everybody who joined us in this panel. This roundtable, it was really fascinating conversation. I know we could have gone longer, and I really do. You are on record as being invited to come back in 10 years, hopefully sooner, actually. But I would love to, if I'm still teaching and, we still have a country and all this stuff, let's all get back together and have this conversation again. I'm going to hand it over to Iklak because he's going to wrap up with one final question that we ask at the end of every one of these roundtables.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to just agree with Ken, and like the panel's been fantastic. And, I think we covered like a lot of points, everything from demand in news is increasing and subscriptions are increasing, and companies, news organizations are becoming technology companies, and the intersection of AI and the misinformation topics and the economics of the misinformation topics. So like, there's a lot of stuff there. I think that's great. The one, if you have a, I'm going to say like just a super quick response to this one last thing. As we said in the beginning, we're looking for advisory board type of input. So, you know, the things that we're talking about today, what should we be doing, either in our labs or in our collaborations, or in our classes, or whichever, you know, what can we be doing, and who can we be connecting with to go further in the types of things that we're talking about today? That's the hardest question, by the way. You know, it's always the tough one, because you have to translate it for us.
I'd say that there is a need for a lot more entrepreneurial and engineering attention when it comes to news. Like if you think about where a lot of kind of focus goes, and especially if people are in the job market where they're going to dedicate their time, I find that a lot of engineers that work for me at the Post are really about the mission, right? Whereas they could easily go to, you know, Facebook or Google or any of these other companies and be building for them or build their own company. So I'd say like we work directly with a lot of universities. We build a lot of great projects and encourage collaborative projects. So I would say as much time and focus as people could look into how to build better media models, how to work closer with like media institutions, or how to enable the launch of new media institutions. I'd say like democracy depends on it, and it's definitely under threat. So the more minds, the better.
Okay, all right, thank you. We can follow up on those. We do a lot of data and AI projects.
For anyone looking to make the trip across the pond, I would promote exploring NLP, NLG opportunities in Europe. These language AI technologies, they're still really young in smaller languages, really developed in English and Chinese, but for anyone looking into that space, you could really contribute to the future of media if you look into smaller languages.
That's a good insight. That's great.
I'm marking that down.
That's how we could reach out to the language departments at Cal, right? That particular topic.
I
Okay.
was just going to say, just on languages, but also just ML languages, but also just languages as such. If you can make your products as adaptable as possible, it just makes a world of a difference. I think when you look at journalism as an industry, it doesn't have the same means as, you know, the health sector or the tech sector, where you have big research and development, you know, capacities. So you need to be really nimble. And so keeping really your end users in mind and how they can adapt your technology, whether in different language or different dynamics, is something that's very valuable. So it's not a direct application, but just a general observation.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm just giving like 10 seconds to make sure there's not another comment. And if not, I think we actually do need to wrap it up. We're running just a couple minutes late, but awesome conversation. Like, I don't think we could have got more insight, you know, focused into 1 hour. It was really great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.